Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our weekly Chats on the Past program, where the museum discusses history with scholars, authors, historians, and artisans. My name is Nicole Carpenter. I'm the Director of Programs and Education for the Westport Museum for History and Culture. Tonight, our program is offered for free as usual, and we do, of course, ask that you support the museum however you can. We have a suggested donation of $5 for all of our programs, but we do understand this is still a very difficult and challenging time. If you have been enjoying our programming and you'd like to be notified in the future, you can follow us and like us on our Facebook and Twitter pages at Westport History and on Instagram at Westport History Museum. During our program tonight, if you have any questions, comments, or anecdotes that you'd like to share or ask, please enter them in the chat box, and we will go through as many of those as we possibly can at the end of our Q&A tonight. We are joined this evening by Andrew Kahrl, Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Virginia. He's a scholar of 20th century US and African American history, specializing in race, real estate, and leisure space in urban and coastal America. He's the author of The Land Was Ours, African American Beaches from Jim Crow to the Sun Belt South, which received the Liberty Legacy Foundation Award from the Organization of American Historians. He has also written Free the Beaches, the story of Ned Coll and the battle for America's most exclusive shoreline, which we are going to speak about tonight. So thank you so much for joining us, Andrew.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to speak with your patrons and audience.
Of course. So we are going to jump right into our questions. And I thought we would start with, how did Free the Beaches come about? How did you become interested in this story? And what kind of sparked Free the Beaches?
Yeah, it's a great question. You mentioned in your introduction that my first book was on the history of African American beaches in the Jim Crow South, and that story of how African Americans struggled to claim space in coastal areas and develop leisure facilities and leisure spaces for African American people was the focus of my first book. But in the course of writing it and doing research on the role of leisure and battles over leisure space in the segregated South, I came across, just fortuitously, came across a story about this activist up in Connecticut who in the 1970s was seeking to integrate the beaches along the Connecticut shoreline that he believed had been functionally segregated through policies that restricted access to residents only, or otherwise put measures that prevented the general public from using the state shoreline. And so in the course of doing research for my first book, I was really struck by this story and felt that it was deserving of more attention. I came to see that there hadn't really been anything written about Ned Coll, and felt that it was one that really wasn't just a compelling story of an activist and of a movement to open up public space in America, but was also one that called attention to the ways in which segregation functioned in the North, that the phenomenon of Jim Crow wasn't just something that was exclusive to the South, but was also something that operated maybe in different ways, but often had this similar effects for African Americans living in a place like Connecticut. And so that's really kind of what sparked my interest, was just, and also I was really struck by just how compelling the story of the activism that he practiced, as well as just how controversial it became and how it raised a host of questions that really went beyond just the beach itself to include the roles of local governments in adopting exclusionary policies that extended into housing markets and other arenas. And I think that was something that really stood out to me, is that we need to think about, and my interest in looking at beaches and leisure space is part of a larger interest in looking at injustice and inequity, and how how activists in the past have sought to bring about more just conditions.
And those stories are very familiar to anyone that's been paying attention to what the museum has been doing in the last couple of years. We've had some histories, some fascinating histories about things like Project Concern, when underprivileged children were brought into Westport schools, and the backlash that happened in the 70s because of that project. So this is definitely something that rings a bell to some of our Westport audience members.
Yeah, I think, that time period in New England, in Connecticut in particular, in the 1960s and 70s was a very tumultuous moment where a lot of these simmering issues about how do we bring about meaningful desegregation in our schools? How do we create greater diversity in our communities really came to a head. And in some ways, the way that Ned Coll and the Revitalization Corps approached these issues certainly generated discussion and debate. And I think that was one that when you get people talking about these issues, it certainly is one that can reveal larger problems that were affecting both white and African Americans in Connecticut.
And we see this activity in Connecticut, and you mentioned obviously your research in the South. Do we see this across the United States on the West Coast as well?
Yeah. So just to back up a little bit, so what Ned Coll, as he began as a social activist, really focusing on providing greater opportunities for underprivileged children in Hartford, Harlem, and other urban centers to both, both in terms of schooling, in terms of providing resources to needy families, and also as well providing recreational opportunities for children, especially during the summer months when kids were out of school. And so, when he began, and this again was part of, there were countless numbers of these small, independent social service and activist organizations operating across the country. It was kind of the spirit of the era toward volunteerism and toward civic engagement. And so Ned Coll was very much a product of his time. And also as well, this issue of beach access was something that was very much a hot button issue during the 1960s and 70s, when nationwide you began to see local movements in coastal communities that were challenging what they felt, what they saw as being these exclusionary practices that had been adopted by wealthy towns and by homeowners and by developers that had sought to first restrict access to shorelines, and in some cases just simply prevent the public from accessing what is legally public land. So this was, again, part of the story that I'm telling here is a story about Ned Coll as an activist and the controversies that erupted in Connecticut, but also one that fit into this larger national story in which you saw really a growing sense of real outrage amongst many Americans that this public resource was being appropriated by private individuals and or wealthy communities. And so this was very much one that he joined into a larger stream of activism over what came to be known as this Open Beaches movement, seeking to really put in place measures to ensure that the public could have access to coastlines and that they could not be fenced off or otherwise restricted in terms of who could enjoy it.
So can you tell us a little bit more specifically about Ned Coll and how he became involved in this movement to open Connecticut shoreline?
Yeah, so Ned Coll was, he was born in Hartford in 1945. He was from a large Irish Catholic family. He attended Fairfield University, Fairfield College at the time, and during that time, I mean, he was very much kind of destined for, as he put it, a white collar job in insurance. In fact, actually, after he graduated from Fairfield, he came back to Hartford, his hometown, and got a job in an insurance working in an insurance agency, and was sort of kind of climbing that climbing that ladder to success, and was destined to have a conventional life that like many of his peers. But he was very he continually said that, the assassination of John F. Kennedy really shook him to a core. He was deeply affected by that, and also deeply affected by what he saw was Kennedy's call for social engagement and for citizens to do more to help better society. He kind of had this new frontier ethos that he really took seriously. And so after Kennedy's assassination, after some soul searching, he abruptly quit his job and took what little savings he had and started this, what he called a domestic Peace Corps. And he named it Revitalization Corps. He rented a storefront in Hartford, later moved on to the north end of Hartford, the predominantly African-American part of the city, and began working, just working the streets, trying to engage with people, trying to find out what needs families had, and trying especially to get more middle-class white Americans, the folks who, people of his generation who had moved to the suburbs and had, in some sense, kind of abandoned the cities like Hartford, and get them more engaged in the real work that needed to be done in underprivileged communities that he felt had been left behind. So he's doing this, and again, he's much to his parents' disapproval. They thought that they couldn't believe that their son, their pride and joy, had decided to go and quit a good job and instead become involved in social activism and in working on behalf of poorer families. But he persisted and continued working and building up what became, for a time, Revitalization Corps wasn't just based out of Hartford. He was trying to lead a call to action nationwide, and for a time there were chapters of Revitalization Corps that sprung up in cities across the country, from as far south as Miami, Florida, to Watts, LA. There were people. He had his words and his actions caught a great deal of attention for a time in the mid-1960s. There was a profile of him in Life magazine. There was, he received many commendations for the work that he was doing as someone who was seen as someone who had pure motives and intentions in trying to work with communities and work to help bridge what he saw as this growing racial divide in America. He was very moved by the Kerner Commission report in 1968 that diagnosed the causes of civil disorders, what the media often termed as riots that were unfolding in cities. And the work that Revitalization Corps was doing was in many of these areas that were hardest hit by urban unrest in the 1960s. Cities like Newark, where they had a chapter. He was working in Harlem. So, this again was, throughout the early years of Revitalization Corps, they were working on a number of issues. The issue of summertime recreation for children was just one among many areas of concern. But then, at a point in the late 1960s, he decided that one of the campaigns that he wanted Revitalization Corps to focus on was getting kids out of the city during the summer. And this was a real problem because cities like Hartford had really underinvested in summertime recreation, especially in Black neighborhoods, which lacked swimming pools, parks had become fallen into disrepair. And then you had that was coupled with in many cities, and not just in Hartford, but summers were often very deadly for Black families and children, where you had shockingly high numbers of drowning deaths amongst Black children. This was, subject of protest and activism on the part of African-American mothers in Hartford in the late 60s, who sought to get the city to fence areas of the Park River that had claimed the lives of several children who were playing there because there was nowhere safe otherwise for them to go. So he clearly saw that there was a real need here to provide structured recreational activities for children who were lacking in other options. And that's what started him with this idea of renting a bus and bringing a busload of kids from Hartford down to the state shoreline. And he thought, they would just get down there and they would find a beach and they would go have a great day. Everyone, who's going to stop you from going to the beach? But then when they got there, they discovered that in fact, there was very few public beaches they could access. And the beach that they did attempt to go to in Old Lyme. It resulted in a very ugly incident in which the homeowners were adamant in their determination to keep them off the shore. And it was pretty clear that race was a factor in the reasons why they were so unwelcoming to a group of Black and brown children from Hartford. And at that point, then Ned Coll became very much concerned about this issue. And he and for the next several summers throughout the late 60s and throughout the 70s, as I write about in the book, he engaged in a concerted campaign to not just get kids onto the beach so they can enjoy a day at the beach, but also to really draw greater public attention to what he saw were the exclusionary actions of shoreline homeowners, private residential communities, and then the towns that had adopted these ordinances that restricted access to residents only. And that's really where the meat of the story that my book tells unfolds, is during the 1970s, during these summers where Ned Coll became someone who was a real lightning rod for controversy in this, someone who was unafraid, who did not pull punches when it came to calling out the actions of shoreline communities, and also one who himself was subject to a great deal of criticism over the tactics that he employed.
Can you tell us a little bit more about who was a part of his movement? I know that you mentioned white families that may have moved out of the city. Was that the core of the people who supported his movement? And also, you mentioned private homeowners and some of these wealthy shorelines. Who are the communities that are really fighting against his movement? Yeah,
so that's a great question. So when Ned Coll began working in Hartford, he really leaned on and worked alongside a close group of mostly African-American mothers, and many of whom around the same age as him, and parents of young children, working parents, and who really shared a lot of his interests, concerns, and believed in the work that the Revitalization Corps was doing in the community. So we had this sort of close core of African-American women who worked in Revitalization Corps. But then there was a lot of idealistic young, many white college graduates who would spend a summer working with Revitalization Corps. You had young families. I interviewed several people who really took his message to heart and became involved in Revitalization Corps, tutoring children in public housing projects in Hartford, bringing them out to their homes in the suburbs, or working on other campaigns. So it was it was an interesting mix. There was a lot of people who were involved in Ned Coll. I should also mention he was a very devout Catholic, and there was a lot, and he really kind of maintained a spiritual dimension to Revitalization Corps during these years. So there was a lot of social justice activists from the Catholic tradition who were involved in Revitalization Corps. But it was a really eclectic, interesting mix of different individuals who were drawn to the message that he was sending, and who cared about the issues that he cared deeply about, like, say, the issue of beach access. But that was in contrast with many of the shoreline towns who, and public officials in these towns who really did not appreciate the way that Ned went about his activism. And he gave as good as he got. I mean, one town in particular where there was a lot of controversy was Madison, where Ned, he really was determined to break open that town's shoreline, which he saw as one that where the town had policies in place that really restricted the ability of non-residents to use the town beaches. And so he, and that was an issue that he really wanted to call attention to. And so he did so by, at one point, perhaps most famously, he staged an amphibious invasion of a private beach club where boatloads of children came ashore and played on the wet sand. Which was meant on the wet sand portion of the beach, which was perfectly within their rights because, legally, the wet sand portion of the shoreline is public land. And so, but he was calling attention as well to the fact that, while this was, no one questioned whether or not this was public land, you couldn't actually get to it by land because there were so many fences and walls put in place to prevent access. So that was, one that, generated a great deal of publicity. So, he thought he felt that these types of actions were drawing attention to the cause. His critics would say he was just drawing attention to himself, and that these were stunts aimed at, getting a lot of media attention, but maybe not bringing about change. So there was clearly a great deal, and especially as this continued on summer after summer, there was a real, summer, a time where, many folks who live in these shoreline communities, simply wanted to enjoy a day at the beach, and Ned was, determined to, use this as an opportunity for social change.
Ultimately, I do want to bring our discussion to the current day and age. So I would like to know what the status of Connecticut's beaches are today, but also how successful or unsuccessful Coll ultimately was.
Yeah, so, he, well, for one, I mean, the issue of beach access has changed dramatically since the pandemic. And, this past summer has actually, I would say, has probably been one of the most controversial in terms of beach access, and one in which we've seen a lot of activity and activism on this issue, perhaps at no point since Ned Coll was working in the 1970s. So, once the pandemic hit, and you began seeing in the late spring and early summer, many shoreline towns reintroduced as emergency measures, resident-only ordinances. So going back to restricting beach access to residents only. And there has been a great deal of pushback on both those who are saying that this is not a, this is driven more by exclusionary motives and public health concerns, but also as well these legal questions about, is this in violation of the state's constitution, and the ruling that was handed down by the state's Superior Court in 2001 in the Layden versus Greenwich case. So this is, so just to back up, I mean, this, many of your listeners might already know this, but in 2001, and this is, I tell the story in my book as well, a man named Brendan Layden, who's now an attorney in Stamford, he sued the town of Greenwich over their resident-only beach access ordinance. He was actually a law student at the time and was jogging along on Todd's Point, and was stopped and prevented from jogging along the beach because he wasn't a resident of Greenwich. He, as sort of a third-year law student who's had been studying these issues, felt that there was something not right about this, and took his case. It made its way all the way up to the state's highest court. And in 2001, the state's Superior Court ruled that that towns could not have public beaches or public parks that were available to residents only. That now it's still allowed for towns to include charge a fee, say, and maybe even a higher fee for non-residents versus residents, but they could not just simply have a blanket ban that excluded non-residents. So again, that's been in place since that's been in place since 2001. But this past summer, we've seen again, invoking public health concerns, a reintroduction of that as to what will whether or not this will emerge, there will be a case challenging this, challenging these measures, or whether or not they will just go away once the pandemic's over remains to be seen. But that's, and I think again, kind of as well, we've seen groups that have emerged. I know that there's a group in Connecticut called that's focused on coastal access defense. that has been working to call attention to these issues, in particular focusing on some of the actions of beachfront homeowners who have put in fences in places. I know in one case in Old Lyme, or actually no, I should say in Old Saybrook, where a fence around a beachfront property that is in violation of public access rights. So this is, yeah, it's been actually a very interesting, very contentious summer on the state shoreline, and in ways that we haven't really seen since the 70s. So in some ways, the story that my book tells is very timely in that respect.
That's very interesting. I would love to hear more, and I'm excited to read the book and learn even more of these fantastic stories. At this point, we are open for our audience to ask any questions. I do have a couple of questions that were sent in before our program, and one of them wanted to know, is Ned Coll still alive? Is he still fighting to open the beaches? Is he still active?
Yeah, so Ned is still alive. He is Ned is he's in a nursing care facility, but he's still still doing. He's still with us, and still I'm sure as cares about these issues as much now as he ever did. He has his work as an activist. He continued on. Beyond the 1970s, and continue. And again, I try to sort of bring his story as and the story of Revitalization Corps to a conclusion in the book. But yes, he's still someone who has been very again, someone who has been dedicated to social activism throughout his life. Again, that's been one that he still continues to fight. Even in his advanced years.
And earlier you mentioned that you conducted some interviews for the book. What other sources were you able to access, both oral histories and primary sources, kind of pamphlets and things like that? What were you able to use to tell your story? Yeah, no, that's great. So, speaking with the kids and, again, adults now who were a part of this, which was, the first place I tried to go to was, and I've been able to make some, wonderful, meet some wonderful folks who live in various parts of Connecticut, many who are still living in Hartford, who were those who were going to Revitalization Corps headquarters after school for, and a part of various initiatives that they, whether it be jobs training for high school students, whether it be, lobbying state government to provide home heating oil. I mean, there was, they were, Revitalization Corps at virtually every kind of issue that was affecting poor and working people in Connecticut in the 1970s and 80s, they were involved in. And so it was, the course of just doing interviews and getting to meet with the network of people who cross paths with Ned Coll and Revitalization Corps was just every interview I did, I just it just vastly enhanced and enriched the story that I was trying to tell. But certainly the children who were a part of this and what they, from their perspective, how they experienced these spaces that many of them had never really entered into before. I mean, growing up on the north end of Hartford, a place like Madison or Greenwich might as well be on the other side of the earth. And that's, I think, also one of the stories that I really try to tell throughout this book is it's really a story of inequality and how it's lived and experienced in America. And how, while for many middle class and privileged families, a day at the beach is just, taken for granted, and summer vacations are something that are just, a rite of passage that every family engages in. But for many in the state of Connecticut and across America, that's not a part of their reality. And so, that was something that for them, just getting to learn sort of how they saw what was unfolding around them. In particular as well, it was interesting to sort of talk with many of the children who saw these as just trips to the beach. They didn't know that they were actually engaged, that there was an activist sort of angle to this was interesting as well.
as well as talking to some of the women who worked alongside Ned and worked in helping to shape the programming. There was a woman who, Early Powell, who she's since passed away, but she was just an incredible source of inspiration for me. And she was just, she was a person who raised her family, worked full time, and then also was involved in the activism and all the initiatives that Revitalization Corps was undertaking, and just an incredible life. And so that was, I think, in many ways, speaking with people, getting to know folks, and getting to know this story on an intimate level was a critical element to the writing the book. But the other good thing, and again, as I mentioned earlier, Ned was very good at attracting media attention. And that's something that many of his critics sort of said that, sort of charged him with, simply seeking media attention. But one benefit of that for an historian is he left a long paper trail. There was, going into the Hartford Courant archives, if you go onto the digital, onto their digital database and just type Ned Coll in quotes, you'll get thousands of articles. He was able to get news coverage for the work that Revitalization Corps was doing and for the protests that he was leading. So the journalists, and several of whom I also spoke with later, like Tom Condon from the Hartford Courant, legendary reporter and columnist. Many of your listeners probably are familiar with him. He was someone who I interviewed early in the research and continue to keep in touch with. He was there for all of this, and so so I think that certainly. Local journalism is such a critical source of material for historians. And I think, again, that's something for me in particular helped to tell this story.
The last question that we have tonight, someone asks, do you have a favorite kind of stunt that Ned pulled?
Wow, there were so many. I think, well, perhaps the most famous one, and this being a presidential election season, I should mention, and I have a whole chapter devoted to Ned Coll's quixotic 1972 run for president, despite the fact that he was not old enough to become president. But he was trying to make, again, people dismissed it as a joke, but he was actually very serious about the issues that he wanted to bring to into the campaign, and so he ran for president on the Democratic ticket in 1970, or in the Democratic primary of 1972. Again, very much as a protest campaign, trying to call attention to the issues of urban poverty. That he felt that again, he having spent so much time on the north end of Hartford, having seen the struggles of families, of parents, having seen the erosion of jobs within cities, and as well, the crumbling infrastructure, the crumbling apartments that many were living in, and the struggles of families. And he felt that this was just not getting the kind of attention that it needed from the other major candidates. So so he runs for president, and he's able to get onto the ballot in New Hampshire, the first primary. And because he was on the ballot, at the time, there was a debate, actually a nationally televised debate. It was on PBS, a nationally televised debate in the Democratic primary, in which Ned Coll was on stage with the other major candidates because he had made it onto the ballot. And again, the reason why he made it onto the ballot was because of, and again, I was talking to some of these folks, like, these women from the North End who went up to New Hampshire and were knocking on doors, getting people to sign the petition that would get him the number of signatures to be a candidate. So he succeeds in getting on the ballot. And then in this debate, where he's up there on a stage next to George McGovern, Ed Muskie, these major major Democratic establishment figures, and there's 32-year-old Ned Coll. And when he gets the first question that he's asked, he says that the real issue in America is the rat. And he pulls a rubber rat out from his coat pocket and holds it aloft on the stage. And he was saying that, look, the point he's trying to make here is, rats were a serious problem in urban neighborhoods that have been suffering from neglect. And, the fact that, parents would have to lie in fear that their child might be bitten by a rat, in their cribs, was a very real problem. And it kind of typified, in his mind, the whole kind of broader array of policies that had left urban America behind and had really neglected the basic health and human dignity of urban communities. And so, that was what he was trying to demonstrate when he pulled this rubber rat out from his coat pocket. But which again, if anyone who knows, most folks, I'm sure many of your listeners in Connecticut probably had heard of Ned Coll, but nationwide, that was his kind of 15 minutes of fame. The next day, newspapers across the country, from New York Times to the Boston Globe, international newspapers. I even found, there was coverage overseas that were saying like this, because, this is on a nationally televised presidential debate. This 32-year-old guy who pulls a rat out of his coat pocket during a debate was certainly one for the ages. And I think, I think every time, the New Hampshire primary rolls around, you'll see someone kind of, write some column about crazy things that have happened in the New Hampshire primary before. And they invariably will mention Ned Coll pulling a rat out of his pocket.
He sounds like quite the character. That's really amazing.
And I was able to find a picture of it as well that is included in the book too. So it really happened.
That's fantastic. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We encourage you all to pick up a copy of Free the Beaches, The Story of Ned Coll and the Battle for America's Most Exclusive Shoreline. And I want to thank you, Andrew, for speaking with us tonight. Is there anything you'd like to leave our listeners with before we sign off for the evening?
No, well, just again, thank you so much for inviting me to speak. And I'm really, again, I hope that for many of your listeners, especially those who are troubled by the state of race and inequality in America today, and who really care about bringing about a more just and equal society, I hope that this book offers lessons for a path forward in terms of how we can begin to gain a deeper appreciation of the lived experience of inequality that goes transcends even jobs, housing, the workplace, which are of course critical areas, and as well as of course policing and law enforcement. But also to include these areas like, say, leisure and recreation, and other ways in which things that we all recognize as fundamental to human rights and human dignity, and as that are being denied to many families and children in America. And this is again something that it's not the one issue, but it's one among many that I think we need to devote more attention and focus on how we can build a more better and equal society going forward. And I think ultimately that's one of the lessons of what Ned Coll and Revitalization Corps was can teach us.
I think we all have equality and equity questions on our mind today, and I think that's a great thing to be learning more about and educating ourselves, so that hopefully we can bring about a society that embodies that a little bit better. So again, thank you so much for joining us, Andrew. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and enjoy your weekend. Thank you so much, everyone.
Great, thank you.